Thank you for joining us today here on Connect and Collaborate, where we come together each day to introduce you to our network of business and community leaders and to discuss the important issues that impact business in Colorado and the region. I'm Tammy Schaefer, your on-air producer, and today we're connecting with Mark Spitz of Spitz Legal Counsel. He's a business, cybersecurity, and data privacy attorney. Mark, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I'm also joined by Keenan Brew. He's a producer with Icosa Media, where he's also a web developer. And Keenan, I know you like to dabble your interests in this area anyway, so it's great to have you along to enrich the conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. And in my role as a web developer, cybersecurity is an incredibly important space, both on the technical side as well as all the human aspects of it. So it's an area where it's constantly evolving, so it's important to keep learning and try to figure out what those best practices are and actually implement them across an organization.
Absolutely.
And Mark, this is such a great opportunity for conversation because, you know, we're focused on business here in Colorado, and it seems like those small and mid-sized businesses are the growing targets for cyber hacks, right?
They are for a number of reasons. The most recent studies I've seen have said that as much as 43% or more of cyber attacks are targeting small and mid-sized companies. Now, it may depend on how you define small. One of the studies defines small as fewer than 250 employees. A lot of small companies might say that's a big company, but the general trend is certainly that more and more attacks are being targeted at small businesses, and there's a number of reasons for that. Those include small businesses don't have the time or resources usually to devote to the problem.
Yeah, you don't have a devoted staff to making sure you're protected.
Right, and you know, and to build on that point, Target, for example, which was hacked a few years ago, and I think 70 million credit card records were taken. They had a team in India that was monitoring their systems 24/7. They'd spent a lot, you know, millions and millions of dollars on their cybersecurity, and they got hacked because of a refrigeration contractor which was connected to their network.
Is that what it was?
It was, and that contractor was using some cheap anti-malware software to protect themselves, or may even have been like a free download. And so they were a relatively small company.
I was going to say, so that's the small business that had the weak link, right?
Yes, and they were able to get into Target's systems.
Wow.
So, you know, small companies don't often have the resources. Even if they did, you're not invulnerable, but they don't have the resources or the time. And another reason is they still have valuable information. Maybe they don't have 40 million or 70 million records, but they still have valuable information that a hacker can use. For example, in April of last year, the Post had an article on a car wash on Broadway that was hacked.
And that's got to be thousands upon thousands of credit card numbers.
It was. I think it was several thousand credit card numbers. So pay cash next time you get your car washed there. But not a large business.
Another thing to worry about.
or go to the do-it-yourself like I do.
Right.
Yeah, so it was a small business, but it was several thousand records that had some value, and the company got hacked, and it cost them a lot of money, which we can talk about later, to deal with that. So small businesses are increasingly a target.
Well, you mentioned that one large company, Target, but I've also heard in the last couple of years of maybe a Home Depot or an Equifax, and these are large companies where this is central to their business, and they still can't protect from every angle. So much less some smaller companies who may have some good practices in place, but you're missing, you know, one or two key areas, and something can happen.
Well, and you know, as we'll talk about it, you know, it's often the action of an employee or some other person, and it may not be malicious, that leads to a cyber attack getting through or a hack. For Equifax, for example, it was their sloppiness. They didn't update their software, which is one of the best practices we can talk about. They knew they had to update some of their software. They didn't. And in that period of time, the hackers got in, and it was several weeks before Equifax even knew that they were being hacked.
Wow.
And that was 145 million records just in this country.
So when we're talking about a small business being at risk for a cyber attack, what are the consequences? What are they facing when that happens? I mean, you're losing the records of customers, and I'm sure much more before you even consider the reputation and the trust of your customers once you get everything cleaned up.
Yeah, there's substantial costs, and in fact, there was an article, not to mention the Denver Post again, but in October of 2016 that said that some 60% of small businesses that are attacked don't survive for 6 months.
Oh wow, really?
Which I was astonished at that statistic.
Yeah, me too.
The cost to a smaller business or a mid-sized business to respond to an attack can easily be more than $50,000.
Right.
Wow.
Wow, that'll take you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be a lot more for a big company. Aetna, I think, had a hack. Somebody told me they spent $40 million just on postage to notify all their customers, which is one of the consequences of an attack. Is 48 states and the District of Columbia have what's called a customer notification law. So if you meet the requirements of that law, for example, in Colorado, if you have customer records and at least 1,000 of those records are compromised in some way, you're required to notify all of your customers.
Wow.
And there's different ways you can do it. If you have the customer information, you can do it by email or by mail, even by phone. Not that anyone answers their phone nowadays. But
well, right, and if you start with, I'm calling you from such and such company to tell you about blah, we're going to hang up on you because we're so used to those kinds of calls.
Right, and you're required to notify them, and these laws are not uniform from state to state. They can vary. So if you have customers in another state and that state's law is triggered, you have to notify customers following that state's law, which might be a little different in terms of how long you have to notify or the manner of notification. And then if you don't have customer information, take Chipotle, for example, which was hacked a couple of years ago, in addition to their other problems. They just put a notice up on their website because they don't have customer information on all their customers.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
Although if you think about it, if you go in and just pay cash, your information isn't at risk.
Right.
But they may have notified customers by mail, but they also had a notice on their website, and that's just one local company, another local company that's suffered that, a big company, but
right. But that's just the cost of notifying customers. I'm sure there's attorney's fees and fines.
There can be fines. Yeah, the attorney's fees certainly can come into play if you've violated some law or regulation. So, for example, if you have consumer information, like I go to a retail store or something like that, the Federal Trade Commission has authority to investigate those kind of breaches, and they've been pretty active in recent years. What they'll look at is, did you take reasonable measures? They don't require you to be 100% secure, because nobody can be. The hackers are always a step or two ahead of the rest of us. But they require, what they're looking at is, did you tell customers or your consumers, did you tell them you were going to protect their information? And then did you do the things that you said you were going to do to protect them? If you didn't do that, and you didn't take reasonable measures, they can bring an enforcement action, they can fine you, and if you go on the FTC's website, you can see their enforcement actions. They'll often enter into what's called a consent decree with a company rather than actually taking them to court. But they'll say, okay, here's the things you are agreeing to do, and we're going to come in and audit that once a year or every couple of years. If you're in the healthcare business, a hospital or an insurance plan, there's a law called HIPAA. It's been around for a long time. And that has really extensive privacy and security and breach notification rules. They're very extensive, things you have to do, or if you don't think, and there's other things that you don't have to do, but if you don't do them, you have to explain why. So it's very, very complex. If you're a bank, there's a different set of rules under a different law, which I won't mention, which require you to do certain things to protect customer data. So yeah, there certainly can be fines and enforcement action and legal fees related to that if you have a breach. You can also have legal fees because you might get sued. After Target was breached, for example, and I'm sure with Equifax, there's lawyers who will file what's called a class action suit. So they'll try to get a lawsuit filed that brings in everyone who is affected. And that can be very expensive. Those cases rarely go to trial. They get settled, but it costs a lot of money to settle that. Then to your question also about the costs of a breach is the technical aspects, repairing your system, figuring out, you have to bring in somebody who is knowledgeable about this, a forensic IT person, they might be called, and they'll look at, well, okay, how did the hacker get in? And we can talk later if you want about the different ways that hacks can happen, but how did it happen? What was compromised? What do we have to do to repair your system and to harden it against future attacks? Because some attacks can steal information. Some attacks can just copy it and you still have it. Other attacks, often called ransomware, can freeze or encrypt your information until you pay what's called a ransom to free it. And then even then you may not get it back and you have to repair your data. And there's a surprising number of companies that do not back up their data adequately. I'll just give one example from my own profession. There's a 10-lawyer law firm in Rhode Island a couple years ago that got hacked when somebody, and I was very glad to see it was one of the lawyers, not one of the support staff, clicked on an email that loaded some ransomware.
Oh no!
It froze up their data and their files, everything in their system for a couple of months, and they weren't backing it up.
Oh no.
So they didn't have access to this, and they paid the ransom to the bad guys, and whatever key the bad guys sent to decrypt the data didn't work, so they lost another month.
Oh no.
Like, you can trust these bad guys, right?
Right.
And they claim they lost $700,000 in revenue over 3 months, and their insurance company, we can talk about this as well, their insurance company would not cover that. They said business interruption coverage doesn't apply if it's a cyber attack. Under the general liability policy, which a lot of companies will have a general liability or a CGL policy, it's called, but those won't cover cyber attacks. That's a separate kind of policy, which is relatively new out in the market.
So you can do that separate
you can
policy coverage.
But the policy that this firm had, their general liability policy, the insurer would not reimburse them for their lost revenue, and they took them to court. So so there can be a lot of expenses involved there. And then there's the soft expenses, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, damage to your brand and your reputation. I'm sure some of us stopped going to Target for a little while after that breach, but then we probably all went back.
Trickle back in.
But there's that damage to brand and reputation, which can be very hard to repair. I mean, Equifax, for example, has really suffered. People lost their jobs. There was a serious damage to their brand. So that's certainly an issue. Another one which you don't hear quite so much about is trade secrets.
Yes.
Often the hackers who are going after trade secrets that a company might have, they might be a state actor, like the government of some country. I won't mention any countries, but or they'll use a front organization to go in and try to steal trade secrets. It used to be called industrial espionage was the term. So, for example, a couple years ago...
It's a more glamorous name.
Yeah, it sounds good. But a couple years ago, for example, 2 very well-known law firms in New York were hacked by some hackers from China who wanted to get information on deals that these companies were working on, mergers of public companies, and then they went out and they traded in the stock of those companies, like insider trading, to make money on that, and they did get caught. But so hacking to steal trade secrets, and obviously if you have a valuable trade secret, the 11 herbs and spices, the Coke formula, or anything that's a valuable, a patent that's underway, something you're developing, that can give somebody a real competitive advantage if they steal it. So there's a lot of that that goes on as well. So there's a lot of different consequences, and each of them have potential costs.
We're talking with Mark Spitz. He's a business cybersecurity and data privacy attorney. We're talking about cybersecurity, and we talked about what that cost the cost to a small business that a data breach is, the impact. And in talking about all that, I'm starting to get a pit in my stomach, just like, oh, this is horrible. What can we do to advise companies, small businesses, to be proactive? How can you insure against these? Because like you said, that you can never be 100%.
You can, and when you think about it, a business, especially a small business, has a lot of things to do, a lot of plates to keep spinning, if you will, and it gets very complicated to add one more thing in terms of time, budget, and other resources. Not every company needs a Target or Home Depot-sized solution.
Of course.
There's basic things you can do. The first thing you want to do is look at, what business are you in? Does a particular set of laws apply? If you're covered by HIPAA, say you're a doctor's practice or a health insurance plan, not all of them are huge.
Right.
Then you might be covered by HIPAA. If you're a financial institution, or even an accountant who prepares taxes is covered by the same law as banks when it comes to cybersecurity. If you're just a retailer or somebody else who deals with consumers, then the FTC applies, and you have to take what are called reasonable steps. There's a lot of resources out there for looking at what you need to do. So first you figure out, are there specific laws or regulations telling me what I need to do? If not, you just look at some best practices. So one of them is called the National Institute of Standards, which is NIST. I can't remember what the T stands for, up in Boulder. And they've put out a framework which can be used. And the framework starts with identify, protect, respond, and recover. And that's sort of a good framework to work with. The first thing is identify what assets do you have that are at risk.
Okay.
So what kind of data do you have? And that can also be physical data. For example, you walk into a doctor's office or dentist's office and they've got all the files in that open file. Is that physically secure? If you think about it, anyone could kind of slip back there.
If it's locked at the end of the day, maybe, but yeah.
So look at your assets, both physical and electronic, and prioritize them. What are the crown jewels of your business? What data do you have? Where does it reside? If you're a small business and you just have a couple computers and one server, that's easier. But if you have a whole network and several servers, where does the data reside? Who has access to it? Does everyone have access to all data? If I'm in the human resources function, do I really need accounts payable and accounts receivable access? Right. I don't. So look at limiting access to what each person needs to know so that they don't have access.
So yeah, you're kind of narrowing the window. Exactly.
And then you also want to look at, from a technical standpoint, because it's not just it is an IT function, but it's enterprise-wide. So there's a lot of the things we're going to talk about, which are process and procedure and training. On the IT side, how is your network set up? Does it need to be segmented in a certain way? Do you have firewalls? Do you have good anti-malware, antivirus software? Are you keeping it up to date? For example, with Equifax, they didn't patch it.
Wow.
They were told they needed to patch something, and they didn't. And that happened also with this WannaCry hack that happened last year.
Is that a ransomware type of attack?
It was, but what happened was it got in through what's called an older Microsoft operating system called Microsoft XP, which is about 10 years old, and Microsoft doesn't support it anymore, but a lot of companies still use it because they didn't upgrade to newer operating systems that were more secure. So you want to make sure you're using more up-to-date software, and when there's a patch or an update for it, put that in place.
And could that happen if you just had, one computer out? Maybe you've got 15 employees and one computer didn't get updated.
Sure.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely. And, and if you are running a network like that, usually, and I'm getting out of my area of expertise, usually updates and things like that are pushed out.
Sure.
I'm a Mac user, but if you've got a PC, sometimes when you want to turn it off, you'll get this screen, it'll say, update 1 of 226. And,
right.
And you got to, and what that means is the network is pushing out updates. So again, but that goes to the point of who has the authority and the ability to make changes to computers. You don't want your employees to download software or to put things on their computers that aren't authorized. You want that to be vetted by somebody who knows what they're doing, whether it's an internal or an external person.
And that's interesting because I think of like our company here where most of the company runs on Windows, right? And then the creative team is on Mac because that's more suitable. So you've got to keep track of both there, and then those updates do come. Or
with people using their own personal cell devices, if that's something people are expected to use at work.
That's called BYOD, bring your own device. and that's a big issue because a lot of people are being asked to use their own cell phone. Usually it's not so much a computer anymore, but a cell phone, to get access. So if you're a salesperson out in the field and you want to get information on a customer or something like that, how secure is that? Are you using what's called a virtual private network, a VPN, or some other system to secure that connection? Because if you're just sitting in a coffee shop or a public place that has public Wi-Fi, that's not secure. In fact, some hackers will even what's called spoof the, so say you go to Starbucks, it's the most common example, and you get that little screen that says, Google Starbucks, connect. Well, 99.9% of the time, that's a legitimate connection, but it could be easily spoofed by a hacker, and you think you're connecting into Google Starbucks network, but maybe you're connecting to some bad guy in another country.
And we're getting really accustomed to doing that sort of thing when you're at the airport and when you get on their Wi-Fi, and how would you really know?
You don't.
So, Mark, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit what your business looks like. Sounds like you have to be aware of a lot of different
vectors of attack, best practices.
Yeah, and I, like with this, I go out, I speak to groups and talk to them about how it is an enterprise-wide process. So, what I would like to do, or what I would do is come in and do an audit. You start with an audit, both of the IT, and I would bring in an IT expert to help with that. Do an IT audit, but do a broader vulnerability audit. What procedures do you have in place now? What kind of training? Training is critical. We haven't mentioned that. Most of these hacks come through some action by an employee, clicking on that link or that connection in an email.
PDF.
Or, and they're often a PDF, or you're seeing more of it now in social media, Facebook or LinkedIn, a post. And it might even be something that the person has clearly found you. They say, hey, sign up for the lacrosse dinner. And you click, and because your kid plays lacrosse, and you click on it, and it's a bad link. So you start with an audit. What are the vulnerabilities, both human, procedural, and technical, and then you remedy those by developing some procedures, developing and implementing training, putting the IT fixes in place, firewalls, anti-malware, that kind of thing, and then helping the company develop a response plan so that if they are hacked, they have a plan in place, they know who's responsible for helping recover, rather than getting that call in the middle of the night and you don't know what to do or who to call.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like this is really a situation where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of post-cure. How can people find you and take initiative with this ahead of an incident happening?
They can find me on my website, www.Spitz Legal Counsel. My phone number is there as well, or they can look me up, Spitz Legal Counsel. And you're right, an ounce of prevention can help. It won't make you 100% secure, but it can lower the risk, because hackers are lazy. And if they have trouble getting into your system, they'll just go on to the next one.
That'll help. Thank you so much, Mark Spitz of Spitz Legal Counsel. We thank you so much for so much great information.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoy talking about it.
Hey, we're glad to have you. It's very helpful to our audience. And you stick with us. We'll be back after this break with more.